When Luke and I decided to move to a small town, it felt like the perfect chance for a fresh start. We'd been craving some peace after the chaos of the city, a quiet, tight-knit community where we could raise our 2 kids and finally get some space for the dogs to run around. Everything about the town seemed ideal. The people were friendly, the houses were charming, and it felt like a place where nothing bad ever happened. We settled in quickly, and within a few weeks it felt like home. The kids loved their new school, and our 2 dogs, Max and Bella, seemed to thrive in the huge backyard. Everything was going perfectly, until that evening. It was just after dinner. The kids were watching TV and Luke was out running errands. I had let Max and Bella out in the yard to play as usual. Our backyard was fenced, so I wasn't too concerned when I didn't see them for a bit. But after a while, I realized the yard was unusually quiet. Too quiet. I stepped outside and called their names, no answer. I walked the perimeter of the yard, figuring they'd just wandered into a corner, but they weren't there. I checked the gate. It was still latched shut. Panic set in. I called for them again, louder this time, but the yard remained empty. Luke came home, and we immediately started searching the neighborhood. We asked our neighbors if they'd seen the dogs, but the responses were strange. Most people gave us polite smiles, but didn't seem concerned at all. One man standing on his porch just shrugged and said, "These things happen here." What the hell did that mean? The next day we called the local police. They came by, took a report, but their attitude was just as unsettling as the neighbors. The officer, a man in his 40s with a thick southern drawl, seemed almost bored as he took notes. "Y'all might want to get used to this," he said, handing us a copy of the report. "Things go missing around here sometimes." "Things?" Luke asked. "Like what? People's dogs?" The officer didn't answer directly, he just nodded vaguely and drove off. That night we couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the dogs barking in my head, but the house was eerily silent. The next morning, something even stranger happened. I went to check the mailbox and found a letter. Not an envelope, just a single sheet of paper neatly folded with no return address. It wasn't typed either. Someone had written it by hand. "I know where your dogs are," it read. "But if you want them back, you'll have to follow the rules." I showed Luke, my hands shaking. The letter didn't say what rules it was talking about. No instructions, no signature. We immediately called the police again, but this time their tone was even colder. "Must be a prank," the officer said. "We'll look into it." Except they didn't. Days passed and the police didn't seem to be doing anything. It was like the entire town had written off our dogs as lost for good. Meanwhile, more letters started appearing. Some were left in the mailbox, others on our porch, and once chillingly, one was tucked under the windshield wiper of Luke's car. They were all written by the same hand, and the message was clear. Someone in the town had our dogs, and they weren't giving them back unless we played their twisted game. One letter said, "You don't belong here. The dogs were just the first step." That's when the fear really took hold. It wasn't just about the dogs anymore, it was about us. We were outsiders, and we'd broken some unspoken rule of this place. But what rule? And why did it feel like the entire town was in on it? Luke wanted to leave, but I couldn't stand the thought of abandoning Max and Bella. I started going door to door, asking questions, but the townspeople just stared at me, their polite smiles slipping into something more sinister. The cryptic comments continued, each one more unnerving than the last. "You should have listened," one neighbor said, leaning against her porch railing. "This town takes care of its own." The final straw came when I received a package in the mail. No return address, of course. Inside was one of Bella's collars, neatly folded next to another letter. This one was different, though. Instead of vague threats, it laid out the rules. Rule 1, stop asking questions. Rule 2, trust the town. Rule 3, leave before it's too late. That night, I had a nightmare that felt too real. In the dream, I was standing in our backyard calling for the dogs, but instead of them coming to me, figures started emerging from the trees at the edge of the yard. People from the town, their faces blank and unfeeling. They surrounded me, closing in, whispering those same words. "This town takes care of its own." I woke up in a cold sweat, but the feeling of dread didn't fade. Luke and I finally agreed we needed to leave. The town, the people, the letters, it was all too much. The next morning, as we started packing up, another letter was slipped under the door. "We warned you, now it's too late." We didn't wait to find out what that meant. We threw everything in the car and drove out of town as fast as we could. As we passed through the town's edge, I glanced back and saw several of the townspeople standing on their porches watching us leave. Their faces were completely expressionless, like they were watching something routine, something they'd seen many times before. We never got our dogs back, and to this day I still wonder what the town would have done to us if we'd stayed. When I first got the job offer, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. A fresh start in a small, quiet town that promised peace after years of living in the chaos of the city. I imagined myself fitting right in, making friends, and finding a rhythm in a town where people actually smiled at you when you walked down the street. So when I packed up and relocated to this place, I was feeling pretty optimistic. At first, it was exactly what I expected. The kind of town where everyone waves when you pass by and people still take the time to ask how your day is going. When I pulled up to my new house, a cozy little place on the edge of town, some of my new neighbors even stopped by to say hello. They were polite, offered to help with moving things in, and told me to come by if I needed anything. It all felt almost too perfect. But within the first week, I started to notice things weren't quite right. It started with little things, stuff I could easily brush off, like when I'd be walking down the street and people would stop talking as soon as I got close. I'd pass them, and I could feel their eyes on my back, as if they were sizing me up, whispering things I wasn't meant to hear. It was off. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was a small town after all. Maybe they were just curious about the new guy. Then came the cold stares. Neighbors who had smiled at me just days before now seemed to look right through me. No waves, no friendly greetings, just silence. The cashier at the grocery store, the barista at the coffee shop, even my landlord. They all treated me like I didn't belong. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but the unease kept creeping in. The first real scare was the night I found my tires slashed. I had come out early in the morning, ready to drive to work, and there they were, completely flattened, all four of them. There was no way this was random. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure I wouldn't leave that morning. I called the police, but when the officer showed up, he just shrugged it off like it was nothing. "Probably just some kids messing around," he said with a dismissive wave. I tried explaining how bizarre it felt, how it wasn't just the tires but the whispers, the looks. But he didn't seem to care. "Welcome to small town life," he joked before driving off. Things only got worse after that. A few nights later, I woke up to knocking at my door. It was faint at first, like someone was tapping lightly, but it got louder. Reluctantly, I pulled myself out of bed and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I thought maybe it was kids pulling a prank, until it happened again the next night, and the night after that. I'd get up, check the door, but no one would be there. Whoever was doing this was toying with me, and I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. The final straw came when I opened my mailbox one morning and found a note inside. It was simple, just one line scribbled in red ink: "Leave." Now my stomach dropped when I read it. This wasn't just some harmless prank. Someone, maybe more than one person, wanted me gone. Fast. I walked around town that day, looking at the people who passed by, trying to figure out if one of them was responsible. But no one met my gaze. It was like they knew something I didn't, something they weren't willing to share. I needed answers. I started digging into the town's history, looking for anything that might explain why I was being targeted. Late nights in the local library, scouring old newspapers, anything that could point to what was going on. That's when I stumbled across a series of articles from decades ago. An incident involving a man who had moved to town and mysteriously vanished a few weeks later. The people here had written it off as an accident, but reading between the lines, it was clear something wasn't right. The deeper I dug, the darker the town's history became. Turns out this wasn't the first time someone new had been singled out. Over the years, there were several cases, people who had come to live here, only to either disappear or leave under strange circumstances. The townspeople always had their explanations, their alibis. But it was clear that anyone who didn't fit in didn't last long. One night I confronted my neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Porter, who lived across the street. I asked her straight up, "Why are you all doing this? What did I do wrong?" Her smile was cold, the kind that sent a chill down your spine. She didn't even deny it. "You weren't supposed to come here, Mark. Some people just don't belong." I asked her what that meant, but she just turned and walked back inside her house, leaving me standing there, more confused and terrified than ever. That's when the final wave of harassment began. The knocks at my door became pounding. The notes weren't just left in my mailbox, they were scattered across my yard, taped to my windows, even slipped under my door. The messages were getting more aggressive: get out or else. I couldn't take it anymore. I tried reaching out to the police again, but this time no one came. I tried contacting my landlord. Nothing. It was like the whole town had closed in on me and I had no way out. One night I decided to leave. I packed up everything I could fit into my car and I started driving, unsure of where I was headed, just desperate to get away from this nightmare. But as I drove out of town, something gnawed at me. The feeling that I was being watched hadn't left. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. And there they were. Several cars, their headlights off, creeping behind me. I floored it, heart racing, but they kept coming. I don't know how I made it out, but when I crossed the town line, the cars suddenly turned off onto a side road, vanishing into the darkness. I kept driving for hours, not stopping until I was sure I was far enough away. But even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That I've only postponed whatever they had planned for me. Maybe they'll come looking for me. Maybe they'll just wait for me to slip up and return. One thing's for sure, I'll never go back to that town. When my husband Luke and I found the house, it felt like fate. A cozy old colonial on the edge of a quiet town, complete with a sprawling yard and the kind of wraparound porch I'd always dreamed about. It was perfect, or so we thought. We moved in at the end of summer, still warm enough to leave the windows open and let in the fresh air. Everything about it felt right. The creaking hardwood floors, the smell of the earth outside. Luke and I spent the first few nights celebrating, imagining what life would be like here, how we'd start a family, host friends, and grow old together. But the first sign that something was off came on the fourth morning. I was alone in the kitchen making coffee when the back door creaked open. I froze. Luke had left for work hours ago, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly I walked towards the door, only to find an older man standing in the hallway, his hands in his pockets like he belonged there. "Oh, hey there," he said, giving me a smile as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I just came by to check on the place." "What are you doing in my house?" and I asked, my heart pounding. His smile didn't falter. "Your house?" He chuckled. "I've been coming here for years. Got a key and everything." He pulled out an old rusty key from his pocket, dangling it in front of me. "You need to leave," I managed to say, my voice shaking. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No harm done. Just keeping an eye on the place like I always have." With that, he strolled out the door, leaving me standing there in disbelief. When Luke got home, I told him everything. He laughed at first, thinking I was exaggerating, but the key, the fact that the man had a key, made him pause. "We'll change the locks tomorrow," he promised, trying to reassure me. But I could see the unease in his eyes too. The locksmith came the next day, and for a brief moment I felt better. Until that night. We were sitting in the living room when the front door swung open without warning. Two women stepped in, one of them holding a basket of muffins. "Just thought we'd welcome you to the neighborhood," one said cheerfully, walking right into the kitchen as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. The other one followed, not even acknowledging our presence. "What the hell?" Luke stood up, trying to stop them. "You can't just walk in here." The women exchanged glances, then laughed, a high-pitched, almost mocking sound. "This house has always been open to us," the one with the basket said. "You're welcome to stay, of course. But the house, well, it's not entirely yours." Luke and I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows made me jump. By morning, Luke called a contractor to have all the locks and doors replaced, but when the contractor arrived, he gave us a strange look. "This house," he said, scratching his head. "I've worked on this place before. I'd be careful with the locks, though. Folks around here, they don't like the doors closed." "What does that even mean?" Luke asked, but the man just shrugged and started his work. The final straw came 2 nights later. We were woken up at 2 a.m. by footsteps. They were inside the house, echoing down the hallway. Luke grabbed a flashlight, but I could see the fear on his face as he quietly got out of bed. I followed him, heart in my throat. When we reached the living room, there were 4 people sitting on our couch, staring at us, men and women, their faces a mix of indifference and something more unsettling. The man from the first day was among them. "You really should leave those doors unlocked," he said casually, as if he hadn't broken into our home in the middle of the night. "You're making this harder on yourselves." Luke lost it. "Get out!" he shouted, his voice trembling with anger and fear. "Get the hell out of our house!" The man stood slowly, and the others followed. "It's not your house," he said, his voice low. "It never was, and you're not going to change that." The next morning, we packed our bags. We didn't talk about it, didn't argue or plan. We just packed. As we were loading the car, the old man appeared again, standing at the edge of our driveway. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice full of mock concern. "You haven't even given the place a chance." Luke didn't respond, but I couldn't help it. I turned to him, my hands trembling. "Why?" I asked. "Why us? Why this house?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't understand, do you? It's not about you. It's never about the people. It's about the house. It belongs to this town, always has." We drove away in silence, leaving the house and whatever strange hold it had on the town behind us. But I can't stop thinking about it. I see the house in my dreams, doors wide open, people coming and going like they always have. I know we'll never go back. But part of me wonders if we ever really left. And I still don't understand what they meant by "it's not your house." All I know is they truly believed it. Moving to this new neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start for me. After years of the city's constant noise and chaos, I thought a quiet suburban life would be just what I needed. The little 2-story house with its picket fence and perfectly manicured lawn was a dream come true. It had everything I wanted: a peaceful street, friendly neighbors, and an overwhelming sense of safety. At first, everything seemed perfect. I'd been living in the house for about a month, settling into my routine. Every morning, I'd head off to work around 8 a.m., and every evening, I'd get home by 6. My neighbors, John and Lisa, were friendly enough. They would always wave when they saw me, and I would wave back. It was exactly what I'd imagined suburban life would be like: calm, predictable. But then, things started to get weird. It was little things at first, things I almost brushed off. The first time, John mentioned how nice my dinner smelled. It was an innocent comment, something a neighbor might say in passing. But when I thought about it later, I realized that I had never told him what I was cooking, and my kitchen window didn't face his house. The next day, Lisa asked me how my morning jog was, and while it wasn't strange for neighbors to know each other's schedules, it was the way she said it. Like she'd been watching, like she'd seen every step I took. I tried to shake it off as small-town friendliness, people just being observant, noticing things. But as the days went by, their comments became unsettlingly specific. They knew when I'd changed my morning routine, noticed when I brought in a new plant for the house, even knew what TV show I was watching the night before. It was like they were inside my life, inside my home. Then came the notes. The first one was left on my doorstep. It was simple, handwritten and unsigned. Nice dinner last night. That salad looked fresh. I stared at it, chills running down my spine. How could anyone know what I had for dinner? The windows had been closed, the curtains drawn. The note was oddly casual, but it made me feel like I was being watched. Constantly. Over the next few days, the notes kept coming. Each one was more detailed than the last. Did you enjoy your walk today? Your new dress is lovely. That conversation with your mom was sweet. She seems nice. Each note dug deeper into my personal life, and I couldn't figure out how they knew these things. I was always alone inside my house, always locked up tight. But somehow, they knew. I tried confronting John and Lisa, but every time I brought up the notes, they acted surprised, concerned even. They promised to keep an eye out, but their faces were too calm, too reassuring, like they were hiding something. No matter how much I pushed, they insisted they hadn't seen anything unusual. Desperate to understand what was happening, I installed a security camera above my front door. I felt safer knowing I could monitor what was going on. The first few nights I didn't catch anything, but on the fourth night everything changed. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up with a start, feeling a sudden, inexplicable panic. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed. That's when I saw them. John and Lisa, along with a few other neighbors I barely knew, were standing in my front yard, just standing there, watching my house. Their faces were expressionless, blank, as if they were waiting for something. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I watched them stand there for minutes, long, agonizing minutes, before silently walking away, disappearing back into their houses. The next morning I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just stay quiet anymore. I rushed to the police station, my hands trembling as I explained the situation to the officer at the desk. He listened patiently, but the moment I mentioned John and Lisa, his expression changed. He assured me he'd look into it, but I could tell from the way he said it that nothing would be done. He didn't believe me. No one did. As I walked out of the station, I noticed people on the street watching me, neighbors, passers-by, all with that same blank, unblinking stare. It was like the whole town was in on something I wasn't meant to understand. I was trapped. That night I checked my camera again, and once again they were there. This time they weren't just standing in my yard. They were closer, right up against my windows. I could see John's face pressed against the glass, his breath fogging it up. Lisa stood by the door, gently tapping her fingers against it, almost as if she was knocking, waiting for me to let her in. My phone buzzed. It was a text message, unknown number. "Come outside, we just want to talk." I dropped the phone, my heart racing. Every instinct told me to run, but where could I go? I was alone, surrounded by people I no longer trusted, people who were watching me, controlling me. The tapping on the door grew louder, more insistent. My phone buzzed again. "Let us in, Sarah. We know you're scared." I grabbed my car keys and ran for the back door. I wasn't staying here any longer. As I sped away from the house, I looked in the rearview mirror. John, Lisa, and the others were standing in the street watching me leave. Their faces were illuminated by my taillights, twisted into knowing smiles. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until the sun started to rise. I don't know what they wanted, what they were trying to do, but I knew I couldn't go back. Not to that house, not to that neighborhood. Even now, as I sit here in a motel hours away, I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching, that they're waiting for me to come home. I don't know what's happening in that town, but I'm not sticking around to find out. I was beyond excited when I first moved to this town. After months of planning, Karen, the city girl, was officially starting fresh in the countryside. I'd left behind the hustle, the noise, and all the stress that came with it. This place was beautiful, picturesque. Rows of quaint houses with flower boxes, winding roads, and everyone seemed to know each other. It felt like the perfect, peaceful escape I'd been craving for years. But it didn't take long for things to feel off. It was only a few days after I moved in when the first package arrived. I found it on my doorstep one morning. No return address, no markings, just a plain brown box. At first, I thought maybe one of my new neighbors had left a welcome gift. Small towns are like that, right? So I brought it inside, half expecting to find cookies or maybe a plant. But inside was a knife, not a kitchen knife or something useful. This was more sinister. A sleek hunting knife with a black handle. It was just sitting there on top of some crumpled paper, sharp as hell. My first reaction was confusion. Did someone send this by mistake? I didn't think too much of it and set it aside, though the unease was already creeping in. The next day, another package. Same size, the same plain brown box, and no markings. My stomach dropped when I saw it sitting there, perfectly placed on my doormat, like the first one. I hesitated, but eventually I brought it inside. This time it was a rope, coiled neatly, like it had been prepared for something. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why would anyone send these things? I asked around, thinking maybe it was just a local prank, but no one seemed to know anything. The townspeople brushed it off with polite smiles, saying things like, "Oh, that's probably just someone's idea of a joke." Or, "Kids around here can be a little strange." Their reactions felt too casual, too dismissive, like they weren't telling me everything. But I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just a harmless prank like they said. Until the third package arrived. This one was different. It was heavier than the others, and when I opened it, my heart stopped. Inside, wrapped in the same crumpled paper, was a key. A plain, silver key with no label, no tag, nothing to indicate what it unlocked. At first I was confused, then nervous. A knife, a rope, and now a key? This wasn't funny anymore, if it ever had been. That night I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see someone standing there, watching my house. I even went outside and checked the locks, triple-checking that every door and window was secure. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But then, 2 nights later, I woke up to a sound, a soft click. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. It was quiet, too quiet. That's when I heard it again. Another faint click, like a door handle being turned. My breath caught in my throat. I tiptoed to my bedroom door and listened. I could hear someone inside my house. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the police. But as I fumbled for it, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps creeping down the hall. I froze. They were slow and deliberate, like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. And then it hit me. The key. My mind raced back to the package. The key. It fits my house. Whoever had sent it had been watching me closely enough to know what kind of lock I had. That wasn't just a prank. That was a warning. I had to get out of there. Without making a sound, I opened the window in my bedroom and slid out into the backyard, not even daring to look back. I bolted down the side of the house and ran to my neighbor's place, banging on the door until they opened it, wild-eyed and alarmed. The police came and searched the house, but by the time they arrived, whoever had broken in was gone. They found the door unlocked, the front door that I had locked before going to bed. When I showed them the key from the package, it fit perfectly. That was the moment when it all clicked for me. This wasn't just about scaring me. Someone wanted me out. They were making sure I knew I didn't belong, that this town wasn't my home. And no matter how much the neighbors smiled or acted like everything was fine, they knew. They knew someone had been watching me, and they hadn't said a word. The police didn't find any fingerprints, no evidence to trace back to whoever had been in my house. They told me it could have been a one-off incident, and suggested I change the locks. Change the locks? Like that would stop them. I tried to stay, I did. But after that night, every noise, every shadow outside my window felt like a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had sent those packages was still watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I packed my things and left town not long after. I never found out who sent the packages or why. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the sound of those footsteps in my house and the key.